All right, let's continue with lecture 6B. We're now at this is lecture 6B, unit 6B rather, part 2 video. So as I was saying last time, we are now at a point where it's kind of really a review of what we did with when we looked at cardiovascular physiology, but it's important enough that we should go through it again, and we will. Again, you're responsible for this. Okay, so in terms of gases, each gas, air is a mixture of gases. It is not a unique gas in and of itself, and each gas exerts independently its pressure, independent of each of the other gases in the mix. So the sum of all the pressures together is the total pressure. The partial pressure refers to each of the different gases and is directly proportional to its percentage in the mix. So we have a partial pressure of oxygen, PO2, partial pressure of CO2, PCO2, okay, that kind of thing. That's Dalton's law of partial pressures. And when we look at it in the air itself, the percentages are here for the different gases. There's oxygen, it's about 21%. There's CO2, about 0.04%. It's humidified to a certain degree. This is 46% humidity. 46% humidity. Yeah, 40. This would be. I don't know if that's 46%. No, yeah, 46%. I'm sorry, 0.46% of the total. That's correct. And the total partial pressure is 760. And when we get into the alveolar space, it's quite different. There, the percentage of oxygen is lower because, after all, we are tidal breathers. We breathe in and out of the same hole, the same pathway through the trachea and out. So there's a mixture, and after all, the body itself acts as a sink for O2. The O2 is diffusing out of the alveolar space and into the blood. So overall, the O2 level is lower. And we talk always about partial pressure. Total pressure, 100% is 760. 20.9% of 760 here, 159. So in terms of atmosphere, we have 159. But inside the lungs themselves, the PO2 is 104. PCO2 is 40. It's much higher than what's in the air around us because CO2 is constantly diffusing out of the blood and into the alveolar space. So we have a PCO2 of 40 and a PO2 of 104. This is, again, it's a review. Hemoglobin is the molecule in red cells that carries oxygen. Each hemoglobin molecule has 4 separate polymer strands of globin with a heme group at the center of it that can carry 1 oxygen. Therefore, you have a total of 4 oxygens when the hemoglobin molecule is fully saturated. Hemoglobin, oxygen rather, irreversibly binds to hemoglobin. It has to be able to bind to the hemoglobin and get released from the hemoglobin. So hemoglobin has really these two mutually contrasting properties. It has to be able to take it up and it has to be able to release it in the right context. The key determining factor is that the affinity of hemoglobin varies depending upon the surrounding partial pressure of oxygen. With a high PO2 environment, hemoglobin takes up oxygen, and in a low PO2 environment, the affinity, the ability to grasp oxygen, is reduced, so the ability to hold oxygen is lowered and oxygen gets released. So in a lower PO2 environment, a lower partial pressure of oxygen environment, the oxygen gets released from the hemoglobin, and that's what happens in the tissue. So metabolically active tissues where there's a lower PO2, the Hemoglobin will give up oxygen, and in the lungs where there's a higher surrounding PO2, it takes it up. And that's the situation here. Remember, this is not a percentage. Across the horizontal axis, it's partial pressure of oxygen, and the partial pressure of oxygen in the alveolar space, at sea level at least, is 104. So it'll be fully saturated right up here at 104, PO2 of 104 in the lungs. Hemoglobin can be fully saturated. It then moves back to the heart and gets pumped up out of the heart through the left ventricle into the aorta, and then branches off into all the different parts of the systemic circulation. And when it gets exposed to the tissue PO2, and remember, it doesn't get exposed until it hits the capillaries, where gas exchange can occur, then suddenly it's in a PCO2 environment of 40. I'm sorry, not PCO2. It's in a PO2 environment of 40. The PO2 in the tissues is 40. And so there's a drop in the affinity, and therefore it will release this much oxygen. The ability of hemoglobin to be saturated with oxygen in a PO2 environment of 40, it can only be saturated up to 75%. It's actually 75 to 80%, so 20 to 25% of the oxygen carried on the hemoglobin is released. Remember, you also have myoglobin in muscles, which has a very high affinity for oxygen. It serves as an oxygen reserve. It only gives up, here's the oxygen myoglobin dissociation curve. It only gives up any significant amounts of oxygen when the surrounding PO2 gets really, really low. So here, even at say 20, PO2 of 20, let's say if that's 90, so about 94 percent oxygen, 94 percent. They've changed it to percent. Yeah, the saturation. So 94% saturation is possible at a PO2 of 20. And so it does start giving it up. It's giving up about, say, let's say 6 here. And then here it moves to, towards 10, and then here 20. So very, very, very low PO2s. You will get oxygen release from myoglobin. It's kind of a reserve. It acts as a reserve. I should use the highlighter. Okay, so we're talking about myoglobin here. And at very low PO2 of, I don't know what that is, maybe 5. If the PO2 drops that much, then myoglobin starts acting as a reservoir for oxygen, making some oxygen available. The reason that babies, the fetus, can take up oxygen from the maternal circulation is because human fetal hemoglobin, shown along here, right, that green stripe, has a higher affinity than maternal hemoglobin. So at the interface between the fetal circulation and the maternal circulation, which exists in the placenta, there is exchange of oxygen from the mother's blood into the baby's blood, because of the higher affinity for oxygen in human fetal hemoglobin. Hemoglobin's ability to release oxygen is affected by a number of factors. A key factor is the pH, and this change in affinity due to a change in pH is called the Bohr effect. There is a shift in the curve here towards the lower right. So affinity drops with a decrease in pH. Remember, that kind of decrease in pH will occur when PCO2 is higher. If the PCO2 is higher, you have a drop in pH, and therefore you have a drop in affinity. So metabolically highly active tissues, or any active tissue, will be producing more CO2. The PCO2 will be higher, and when hemoglobin arrives in the blood and into the tissue, it will release more of its oxygen. Another factor, that's the Bohr effect. Another factor, this is not the Bohr effect. This is regarding the affinity in the presence of 2,3-BPG. 2,3-BPG is found in red cells always. It is increased, and the shift can be very, very rapid to higher levels of BPG. 2,3-BPG is found in higher concentrations in red cells when a person's at higher altitude, or if they do a lot of exercise, and the affinity curve again will shift to the lower right with increasing amounts of BPG. So if you have higher levels of 2,3-BPG in your blood, you have an increased ability to dump oxygen into the tissues. Here, the tissue PO2, if you're even at rest, your PO2 of your tissues is 40. Then as the hemoglobin arrives, it will release normally this much oxygen here, 20-25%, that much oxygen from 100 down to here. But if you have higher level of 2,3-BPG, it'll be lower down. Yes, I know that these are marked for pH, but you know, essentially it's the same idea. Okay. So what happens in the lungs and what happens in the tissues? In the lungs, what you have is the alveolar space, is you have the blood arriving, and bicarb will re-enter into the red cell, will combine with hydrogen ions to form bicarbonate and spontaneously. And then under the activity of the enzyme carbonic anhydrase will split to form carbon dioxide and water, and the carbon dioxide gets released, diffuses out into the plasma across the respiratory membrane and into the alveolar space, right there. Okay. So CO2 is released. Where did the CO2 come from? Well, it was produced in the tissues. So when blood arrives in the tissues, CO2 diffuses out, goes into the red cell, and under the activity of carbonic anhydrase forms bicarb, and that dissociates to carbonic acid, and that dissociates to bicarb and hydrogen ions. Bicarb will move temporarily out into the plasma. It's only when it gets to the lungs that it moves back in. What is the most important feedback stimulus? And when we're talking about feedback stimulus, we're talking about what is the most important key aspect that is sensed by the chemoreceptors in your aortic body and carotid bodies. It is not PO2 so much. PO2 does have an effect on that sensory tissue, but it's the PCO2 that is the key factor. If the key thing that drives breathing, the key stimulus, the thing that can be picked up by sensory neurons and relayed into the brainstem, where the signal gets processed and there you have an output to breathe. The key stimulus for breathing in that case is PCO2, percent CO2. Okay, so normally your breathing rate is about breathing rate liters per minute. Actually, I don't liters per minute. 500 times 20, 10,000. So normally it's somewhere down here, 10 liters per minute. But if you raise it, percent CO2 in inhaled air, this experiment is done by increasing the percent CO2 in inhaled air. Percent CO2 in inhaled air normally is way down here. Okay, so this is an unusual experiment where they're really kicking up the PCO2, and the PCO2 has the biggest effect on breathing rate, much larger than the PO2. It does not mean that PO2 doesn't have an effect, but PCO2 is the main trigger. PCO2 20, no, PO2 is 20. I forget the numbers. Okay. Let's go back to tissue. CO2 is produced. The tissues that are metabolically active are producing CO2, and it diffuses out of the cells into the tissues and then into the red cells. I've already reviewed this. This is a key equation that you need to know and be comfortable with for respiratory, for cardiovascular, for renal physiology. All of these, you need to know this equation here and understand it. Now, let's look at both CO2 and O2. And we talked about what happens to CO2 when it diffuses out of metabolically active tissues. And it will eventually be used to form bicarb, and the bicarb goes in the plasma. Meanwhile, the hemoglobin is giving up oxygen and is producing the oxygen, releasing the oxygen, and it's diffusing into the plasma and then across into the tissues. So this equation is being, in terms of CO2, is being driven from left to right in this situation, and O2 is being released at the same time. We then go to the lungs. The whole process in the lungs is reversed, and the bicarb moves back from the plasma into the red cell, dissociates into these two, and goes to form into, dissociates away from the, the bicarb moves into the cells, and you get a combination of hydrogen ions with the bicarb, and you get formation spontaneously of carbonic acid, and then under the effect of this enzyme, carbonic anhydrase will split the carbonic acid into CO2 and H2O, and the CO2 diffuses from the blood into the alveoli. All right, and this diagram shows that with the accompanying, it shows it here. CO2 is diffusing into the alveolar space, you breathe it out. But it's also showing that the oxygen in the alveolar space is diffusing in and combining with hemoglobin. Okay.